On behalf of the Monash Easters Organising Committee, I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the original and ongoing owners and custodians of this land. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend this acknowledgement to other Aboriginal people present today. We acknowledge also that their land was never ceded. I would now like to introduce Travis to introduce our distinguished guest today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Justice Kirby is quite a personal hero of mine, as I am sure he is to all the law students who are in this room. And I think the happiest moment that I had in organising this entire competition was when we had a personal reply from Justice Kirby himself to an email that I had sent that I was worried was not formal enough or was not clear enough with the details. It was genuinely an exciting moment, and I'm sure Peter is the same when he was able to phone call personally. And throughout my law degree, Justice Kirby and his constant judgments, they constantly pop up, and they entertain and intrigue everyone in the room. One of the most notable, and I think is a useful example to introduce all of you to Kirby who do not know him, was the case of Gosper. It was a case of a forgery in a mortgage, where a man had continually made representations to a bank that he was acting on behalf of his wife. At no point did the bank contact the wife, they never saw her, they never telephoned her, and all the postal contact was to a Mr. and Mrs., even though the mortgage and everything that happened was meant to be in her name. And within that judgment, Justice Kirby quite notably pointed out that if the boot had been on the other foot, and if the wife was trying to act on behalf of her husband, the bank would not have acted the same, condemning the bank for treating the wife as a mere appendage of her husband. And the reason why this example is so incredibly useful and I wanted to bring up is it shows the quite niche interaction between social justice and the law that Justice Kirby was able to deliver through his 13 years in the High Court. And it's one of the many countless judgments he was able to give that have helped develop the law to be as fair as possible to everyone it possibly could be. And for the non-law students in the audience who that case about mortgage meant nothing to, I think the best way that I can put forward and describe his brilliance and make it more relatable to a group of university students is briefly talking about his university life. Because I'm not an avid reader, but I have read his biography. It is one of the few books that I have managed to read because of how intriguing it was. And a very standout feature is that Kirby did not do one degree, nor did he do a double degree, but he had gone through an entirety of 4 degrees, while there are many people like me who are struggling to handle the 3 units that they are doing instead of the 4. Not only throughout that time was he doing so many of these things, but he was president of far too many university societies to count, including the Student Society Representative Council. And I could spend the rest of my time here listing the various achievements and awards and times he has spent, but I'm sure you would much rather hear that from him. But of quite notable mention is his time in the High Court, in the Australian Law Reform Commission, winning the Australian Human Rights Medal, and working in various international organisations for the UN, both in his time during his career, but being incredibly active after it. Justice Kirby has flown down all the way from Sydney, sat through 2 hours of flight delays, and made time in an incredibly busy schedule just for all of us and to deliver this speech to you. It is a great honour to have been able to meet him, for him to have watched this debate with all of us, and to be able to introduce him to you. Can we all give a warm welcome to Justice Kirby?
Thank you very much, Travis and Peter, for being my hosts here tonight. I feel absolutely wrung out and exhausted after seeing the debaters in the last performance. It would be extremely difficult for me to choose between the 2 teams. They were both fantastic. I was once, in far-off glory days, the president of the Sydney University Union, now the Union of Sydney University. And I've had a lot to do. I was there at the beginning of the University of New South Wales and of Monash and of many of the universities in Australia, because I was a participant in what was then called the National Union of Australian University Students. And I learned a lot from debating and from dialogue and from advocacy. And it's about that that I want to spend my time with you tonight speaking. Because I've been there where you have been. My stomach has been in a knot when I'm about to present my address. The stress and pressure of expectations, including your own expectations, are enormous. And I know it. I've been there. I've felt it. And therefore, I could empathise with the pressure that is on the finalists and the pressure that was felt by the other teams. So I thank you all and I congratulate you, and I'm sure great careers are ahead of you, and you will look back on tonight as a step in those careers, as I do, and many of the steps that I took in my glorious years as a student politician. Let me begin by calming things down and by a sort of meditation on the wrongs that were done to the First Nations people. These were wrongs that were often done by the law, and they were wrongs which were in part corrected by the great decision of the High Court of Australia before I ever joined the court in the Mabo case. And the correction was not done to the recognition of native title by our elected parliaments. We'd had elected parliaments for 150 years. We're one of the oldest parliamentary democracies in the whole world, but we hadn't got round to it. Remember that, please, when you hear people say, we can't in Australia have a Bill of Rights, because that would hand power over to unelected judges. Sometimes you need people who march to a different drum and to a different time frame. And that's what we found in the Mabo case during the period as Chief Justice Sir Anthony Mason. Today, this very day, 21st of April, is the 95th birthday of the Queen, but it's also the 97th birthday of Sir Anthony Mason. And I'd like you all to put your hands together for a great Australia, and I will convey to him that generations and generations from his, and a generation or so from mine, young people, young Australians in a theatre in Melbourne acknowledged him and thanked him for his service to the Indigenous people of this country and to Australia. A big round of applause for that. Connection with public affairs, I can remember it very, very clearly. I was at a church school, a kindergarten, which was the only break I had from public education, for I am a product of public schools in Australia. But this was a church school on Parramatta Road and Concord Road. It was on the corner of those two big highways in Sydney. The church is still there. It was an Anglican church, and we, the little children in kindergarten, were put on the footpath to wait for a cavalcade which was coming by on its way to the Concord Repatriation General Hospital, which is still there in Uralla in Sydney, and it is accessed by way of Parramatta Road and Concord Road. That's where I grew up as a boy. And the cavalcade included a very large car carrying Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the wife then of the President of the United States, FDR. And she sped past and we had little flags in our hands and we waved them, but I swear that her eyes locked onto my eyes and that I then felt the power of what this great American lady had done. For she was the chair of the Committee of the United Nations that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All people are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's the opening words of the first article of the UDHR. And somebody had to start with drafting that, and that somebody was a professor from Canada by name John Humphrey. He was a professor at McGill, and he was in the Secretariat of Eleanor Roosevelt. And years later, when I was serving on the International Commission of Jurists, John Humphrey was the commissioner elected in Canada, and I was the commissioner elected from Australia. And he told me how, working with Eleanor Roosevelt, he was in New York, the headquarters were then at Lake Success, and he would go home, and in the bus going home, he would jot down the ideas he had for the UDHR. All great projects of human beings have to start somewhere. And remember, please, that the enemy of action is the blank page. You need someone to push things further, and that's what Eleanor Roosevelt and John Humphrey did. I had a teacher in 6th class. It was in a so-called opportunity school. New South Wales has a system which I don't think exists, at least the same, in other parts of Australia, but it's been there for nearly a century in New South Wales, the so-called opportunity schools in primary school and the selective high schools. And I went to one of the selective high schools, Ford Street High, the oldest public school still functioning in Australia, established in 1848. And my teacher in 6th class was Mr. Gorringe. In those days, mere students didn't get to know the first name of their teacher, but as a result of my mentioning him in a speech, it went on the internet, and somebody who was his granddaughter got in touch with me, and I learned then that his name was Keith Gorringe, teacher in the Summerhill Opportunity School, 6th class. And he had been a soldier in the war. Just about all of the teachers, or many of the male teachers in those days, had that rectangular badge on their coats, which indicated that they'd fought in the war. And like most of them, he was not full of praise and glory and honour and king and country. He was against war. And he was especially against it because of the horrors that had been revealed in the last days of the war, of the Holocaust in Europe, unveiled, I should say, substantially as a result of the work of the Red Army, who played the biggest part in defeating Hitler. And he knew about the terrors of war, and he specially reminded all of us of the dangers of nuclear weapons. I think topics for debate should in the future make sure that they include nuclear weapons. We've tended to put it out of mind for the last 75 years, saying, oh, well, it's a big deterrent. Well, we're seeing now that it may not be such a big deterrent. And if people just lose their temper or do things foolish and angry, as political leaders often do, it can mean the end of civilization. And it's closer today than it has ever been in my life. And it's therefore something we can't mock it or wish it away. We have, as human beings, to confront it. It's an even bigger and more urgent problem than climate change. Unless we deal with this problem, unless we deal with it effectively, and not just for the Russians, but also for North Korea and for all the other tin pot countries that might get nuclear weapons, this is a very serious moment in human history that we reflect upon the fragility of our life on the blue planet. When I went to Fort Street, to the high school, I immediately joined in debating, because the school had a big tradition of judges and lawyers, and I rather fancied the idea of becoming a judge, and I knew they had beautiful robes and long wigs, and I thought, this is the job for me. And so in the first debate, it was more in the nature of an oration. It was a competition by the Sydney Eisteddfod, and we were participants in the oration, and the topic was patriotism. So I remember clearly I got up and I quoted the poem by Dorothea McKellar, "I love a sunburned country, a land of sweeping plains," etc. And at the end of the oration, the marker from the Department of Education said, Mr. Kirby started with a rather pedestrian reference to a very well-known poet, and there was no originality in his thought. He didn't find any way to express patriotism at all, except by resort to a very tired poem, and we're disappointed in his performance, and out of sympathy we've given him 20, something like that. And I was shattered, and it's a wonder I've ever got over it, because it could have been the end of a glorious career at the outset. But he was right. If you're going to be a talker, you've got to engage and you've got to have originality and something that grips and is unusual and is special. And that was a very important lesson. Subsequently at university, I became the president of the SRC and the president of the union and the president of this and that. But when I was there, I took part in the debates committee, and I chaired debates, which was a privilege of the president, and I participated in debates. And I'd like to tell you that I was extremely self-confident. Well, I was still shattered by the markers from the Eisteddfod. I had participated in a team in the second last year at my school, and we were the debating champions of the state of New South Wales. But I still had this flaw and was very nervous when I got up to speak. My stomach was in a knot. I needed gallons of water to clear my throat, and I was something of a psychological wreck. And I say that to you so that if any of you, it may not have occurred in the modern generation, and there may be nobody in this audience who has gone through a similar ordeal, but I've been to that ordeal, and I know that you could be at home watching the telly or taking life easily or go to a party, of which there seemed to be an awful lot of them in Melbourne as I came to this place. But I found it very stressful. I even got to a point where I inquired what concert pianists do. This is my rational mind applied to the problem of stress. And I was told that concert pianists, before they perform the Rachmaninoff piano concerto, they take a beta blocker, and that calms and regulates the heart, and therefore you can cope with the stress of playing the professional role. Well, it does have that effect, but it's also a big dampener, and therefore that wasn't a very good little journey, and I didn't persist with it for very long. At law school, we were taught that the greatest Chief Justice, indeed the greatest lawyer Australia had ever produced, was Sir Owen Dixon, our own Chief Justice in Australia. And he was indeed a great judge with knowledge of all the 19th century cases. He did some very important work in important cases like the Communist Party Dissolution Act case, but he adhered to a theory that judges had no role. I was astonished the other day, I'm sure some of you will have seen it, that the new judge in the Supreme Court of the United States, Justice Kamala Brown Jackson, was driven by the questions into repeatedly saying, I'm not there for policy, I'm there to stick to the rules. I will stick to my lane. You make the policy, I apply it. Well, I'm afraid that final courts of appeal don't march to that drum. They have a vital and important and inescapable and useful role, as the Marbo case illustrates, in developing policy and expressing it where it's been neglected and the law has fallen behind. And one judge at my time at law school who knew this was Lord Denning. And Lord Denning really taught me expression, oral expression and written expression. He would start his reasons for judgment in the most amazing way that no other judge in the common law world did. It was bluebell time in Kent, and so on and so forth. And he wrote with short sentences, which is the style of the evangelist, and he expressed himself in earthy English language. You understand that the English language is the combination of two great linguistic streams. The French stream of the clerk that came over with William the Conqueror, and the Germanic stream of the basic English people when the Normans arrived. And marrying those two together has made for a wonderful language for literature and poetry, but a devil of a problem in the law because precision is much more difficult to get in our language than it is in most European languages. So Denning was a sort of model for me, especially the language of the kitchen. Not the language of the office, the language of the kitchen, and especially the short sentences that were a mark of Lord Denning's craftsmanship. And that's something that I copied when I became a judge myself. On my path to that, I did a lot of cases in the compo court. Some of my later colleagues put their nose in the air to the compo court, but the compo court was orality. It was orality. In the space of a day, we would get through about 7 cases. I would get through 7 cases. You made a lot of money, but you were always on your feet arguing orally. And I remember the very first day I turned up in that court, I was sent up to instruct counsel, though I was a just a fresh law student, and I sat behind counsel. We lost the case, and that was a terrible mortification for me. But I remember seeing the judge at the end of the argument. His name was Judge Conybeare, but there were many such judges in those days where there was much more orality than there is now. A lot of written submissions now. Orality is not so common. But the judge paused when he'd finished hearing the arguments of counsel on both sides. He just paused and I watched him. Never forgotten this. First day as an article clerk in court. And he reached for a glass, he took a glass of water, and then he launched into his reasons for judgment. It was a fantastic performance, I thought. And I thought to myself, I will never be able to do a thing like that. My stomach was turning and my heart was pounding, wondering whether we would win the case or not. And I saw this man go straight into his reasons, and when he had finished and awarded the case for the respondent, we went outside and I explained from his very clear reasons why my client had lost, and I went back mortified but admiring the capacity of someone in our legal system to be able to express themselves rationally, logically, putting everything into its proper place and lawfully and coming to a conclusion. I wondered if ever I would get to be able to do that, and I did. But it took a few decades before I was at his level. In the ALRC, when I was appointed there, I had to adapt to television because we had to try to promote the reports of the Law Reform Commission through television, and that is a very different art. I brought down to read on the plane a new book by Rodney Miller called Australians Speak Out, Persuasive Language Styles. Some of you might be interested to get it. It has a chapter on Chief Justice Griffith, on Alfred Deakin and other masters of our judicial system, and there's even a little chapter on me. And when I looked at the tables, because people analyse these things, the tables for the number of words in a sentence, they analysed 600 speeches of the different speakers. Chief Justice Griffith, in every sentence, averaged was 22. John Curtin, the wartime Prime Minister, averaged was 18 shorter sentences. Mr Menzies from this city, 24. Gough Whitlam, 22. U Giroux of the Noonuccal, Kath Walker, poet, 20. Bob Hawke, 24. Jermaine Greer, 30. And myself, 18. But the interesting figure I found in the analysis was the extent to which people used the word I in their speeches. Griffith, 12. Curtin, 9. Menzies, 5. Whitlam, 21. Ujiru, 12. Hawke, 15. Greer, 27. Kirby, 3. It's interesting to see the way in which the styles differed. And I think there's much to be said for never using foreign and ancient languages, dead languages, but sticking to the English of the kitchen and doing that on television is much more likely to engage. I think one of the reasons for the present election and the fact that they are not really in the book is that they're dampened down. I'm I'm not accusing them of beta blockers, but they're dampened down so that they don't get to a position where they're too excitable. That seems to be necessary nowadays. In the latter part of my career, and more recently, I've taken advantage of the situation to be much more open about my sexuality. And that was something I couldn't really be in the early days. You know, I think looking back on it, debating and talking was a sort of antidote to sex, because yes, I thought you'd like that. It may not now be quite as intense, but it was a feature of debating and talking in those days, and is a feature of the legal profession. That, and it's not just for gay people, it's also straight people, that people who don't really get the sex business turn to other ways of describing their passions. And I've seen that in this brief encounter with you tonight. It's been I had wonderful parents and wonderful siblings, 2 brothers and a sister. My sister has died, unfortunately, but my 2 brothers are there, and I'll be having dinner with them and my partner Johan tomorrow night in Sydney. Johan is the same age as I am, but he looks ever so young, and he's still a good looker as far as I'm concerned. But at the Gay Games, when I spoke at the opening of the Gay Games in 2002, I thought, I'll remember what they said about my performance with I Love a Bright Sunburned Country. So because it was an international games, a bit like the Olympics, but smaller, and the Governor of New South Wales was there to do the official opening, I had to make the opening speech. And I thought, they'll have a lot of people who speak other languages, so I will show them that I can do likewise. And therefore, in the middle of my speech, I shifted from English to French. And I remember checking out the French because I didn't want to get any of the pronunciation or the diphthongs wrong. But at a certain point, I was describing the mayor of Paris, who was the first openly gay mayor of Paris, and how he had been attacked recently because of his sexuality, and that we must stand up and be counted in this respect. Non seulement pour les gays, pour tous. Not only for the gays, but for everybody. And it's important that we should remember these lessons, remember the different skills of talking, remember the pauses that Winston Churchill would interrupt his speeches. I speak to you tonight for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour in the life of our country, of our empire, of our allies, but above all of the cause of freedom. I heard that first on a set of records my father gave me as a boy, and I've never forgotten the feeling of elation at Churchill's command of words and at his interruption. That's become much more difficult with television. If you interrupt, somebody will jump in and interrupt you and make another speech, and it won't be easy to get your point over. But one of the things I thought tonight, watching debating in 2022, is it's more difficult for you, of the cell phone generation, of the TikTok generation, to have pause. And yet pause, a couple of the speakers tonight used it effectively, I thought. But pause is a very important way to emphasise a point and also to communicate, because that's what we do in real life. When you leave the sex antidote of debating and talking and get into real life, first of all, you'll be happier. And secondly, you will know that communication is a very complex thing. It requires refinement, experience. It gets easier. And if you want to have it all analysed, down to the numbers of words in sentences and the way in which Curtin had short sentences, and he was the Prime Minister during the Second World War, and others had longer sentences. But there are techniques, and you can learn them, and the stress will fade, and you can then concentrate on what you're saying and what you want to get over. And if you use a few pauses, it's a very telling way to get messages over. Anyway, I've now filled in your time whilst the adjudicators were adjudicating the final. I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to come here and speak to you. I was a bit late because the Qantas flight had carried a rugby paraplegic team, and they had to be loaded. The flight attendant explained they had to be loaded on and they had to be unloaded, and that added a lot of time to the schedule. But as I thought of the challenges I've faced in my life, some of them delayed by debating, and as I thought of their lives, playing rugby union football in a wheelchair, I thought we must, all of us, take off our hats to such wonderful, brave and talented Australians. Our country is made up of all types. It's made up of Indigenous people, it's made up of women, it's made up of people of colour, contrary to our White Australia policy, and it's made up of LGBTIQ plus, and we must find a place for all of them in our Commonwealth, no exceptions.